Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to support our work. Thanks in advance. The Bible, especially the Old Testament, is without a doubt one of the oldest narratives in human history. A foundational text, passed down, copied, and recited for centuries, long before the rise of modern science. For generations, it's been read as a spiritual allegory or moral guide. But what if we simply changed our perspective? What if it was also in part a collection of eyewitness accounts, raw, sincere, and often naive descriptions of events that ancient people had no words to truly explain? Glowing apparitions, objects in the sky, beings descending from above, cities wiped out by divine fire. So many examples that, when seen through a modern lens, might suggest something else, sightings or even direct contact with an intelligence from elsewhere. Not myths, but maybe blurry memories of an ancient encounter. What if we read the Bible differently? Not as a religious text, not as doctrine, but as testimony. An ancient account written by men who lived in a world without science, without technology, without satellites, rockets, or drones. When they saw something come down from the sky, they had no other words but chariot of fire, burning cloud, or heavenly voice. What if they were simply describing what they saw, using the only words they had? Today, we live in a world where we talk about spacecraft, propulsion systems, electromagnetic fields, and non-human intelligences. So what if these ancient texts, when viewed through a modern lens, were hiding something deeper than those cryptic biblical images we've struggled to understand? Not a religious truth, but perhaps fragments of a forgotten contact. In this video, we're not here to talk about faith. We're here to talk about what some still call visions, and what others now dare to call encounters. This isn't about challenging anyone's faith or attacking religious beliefs. Quite the opposite. But today, it's getting harder to accept the idea that God, the universal source of all creation, would manifest as an old, bearded man in white robes, living above the clouds and riding a fiery chariot. That image, deeply anthropomorphic, belongs to a time when people were trying to give shape to the invisible, to the subtle, with the limited tools of their era. If a creative intelligence truly exists, and I'm convinced it does, then it can only be a primal energy, a field of consciousness, a source beyond all forms, names, and dogmas. And if we accept that, then the biblical accounts, so full of celestial appearances, flying objects, and beings from the heavens, can naturally be reinterpreted through a different lens. Maybe they weren't divine manifestations in the traditional sense, but rather encounters, contacts with entities from elsewhere. Not gods, but travelers, watchers, exogenous presences who came to visit our planet at a time when no word yet existed to name them or describe them. Let's imagine for a moment that a man from the Middle Ages stumbled upon a modern smartphone. He wouldn't have the words or the concepts to understand what he's holding. He might describe it as a kind of shiny black tablet, like polished metal or glass, inside of which live tiny beings. He might speak of magic, of a strange artifact that lets you hear voices and see faces talking inside a flat mirror. To us in the 21st century, that description would sound absurd, nonsensical, even completely fantastical. But from the perspective of a medieval man, it would simply be the best way he could explain what he saw, using the language and knowledge of his time. Now, what if we applied that same logic to the biblical texts, especially those of the Old Testament? What if the wheels of fire, the shining clouds, the heavenly voices, and the beings from above weren't just spiritual metaphors, but genuine, naive, and sincere attempts to describe real technology simply beyond their comprehension? Take, for example, one of the most frequently cited passages in this kind of analysis, Ezekiel's chariot. For context, Ezekiel was a Hebrew priest and prophet from the 6th century before the Christ, descended from the priestly line of Levi. He lived in exile in Babylon after part of the Jewish people were deported by the Babylonians. And it was there, far from Jerusalem, that he reportedly experienced a series of powerful and mysterious visions recorded in the book of Ezekiel. His testimony, especially the famous vision of the heavenly chariot, is considered one of the strangest and most symbolic accounts in the entire Hebrew Bible. The text appears in the very first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, and what he describes is, to say the least, unsettling. I looked, and behold, a stormy wind came from the north, a great cloud with flashing fire, and a brilliant light surrounding it. In the center of the fire, something gleamed like polished bronze. The appearance of the wheels was like sparkling chrysolite, and all four had the same shape. Their structure looked as though one wheel were inside another. Above the expanse over their heads was something like a sapphire stone, shaped like a throne. And seated upon this throne was the appearance of a human figure. I saw what looked like glowing metal, like fire, within and all around him. From what seemed to be his waist upward, and from his waist downward, I saw something like fire. Radiant light surrounded him completely. The description Ezekiel gives us in the first chapter of his book is without a doubt one of the most mysterious passages in the entire Bible. And for good reason, reading it is incredibly disorienting. He's clearly trying to describe a complex, spectacular scene using words that now seem vague, repetitive, and almost incoherent. He speaks of creatures with multiple faces, interlocking wheels full of eyes, thrones in the sky, human-like figures made of fire and light. Everything feels fragmented, as if he's struggling to give form to an experience that completely overwhelms him. And that's probably exactly what's happening. Ezekiel is an old man, witnessing a phenomenon he can't comprehend, something he has no way to analyze with logic or reason. He's simply writing down what he sees using the words of his time with no technological or scientific framework to help him make sense of it. And it's that raw sincerity that makes his testimony so striking, and maybe even priceless. For centuries, this passage has inspired mystical, symbolic, and religious interpretations. But when we look at it through a modern lens, certain details suddenly start to feel familiar. Luminous objects in the sky, moving geometric shapes, metallic structures, a flying throne, and above all, those strange interlocking wheels whose behavior oddly resembles that of a craft capable of moving in all directions, much like some of today's reported UFO sightings. What if Ezekiel was simply describing what he saw, not a symbol, not an allegory, but a witness account? Maybe what he experienced that day by the river wasn't a mystical vision, but a contact, a real encounter with a presence from elsewhere recorded using the only words and concepts he had, shaped by his time and worldview. He didn't know technology. He spoke the language of fire, of celestial wheels and divine beings. Among the most striking and unsettling episodes of the Old Testament, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah holds a unique place. Two sinful cities struck down by a force that came from the sky. sky. In the collective imagination, Sodom and Gomorrah have become the ultimate symbols of human downfall. Two ancient cities, wealthy and powerful, but rotten to the core. The Bible describes them as places of utter corruption, filled with violence, arrogance, and immorality. It speaks of theft, rape, depravity, lust, pride, ways of life that had become completely incompatible with any form of harmony or spirituality. These weren't just sinful cities, they were entire societies that, according to the story, had crossed a line. And it's that transgression, this point of no return, that triggered an intervention from above. The biblical text leaves no room for doubt. Two angels come to warn Lot, one of the few righteous men in the city, to flee as quickly as possible. Shortly after, the Lord rained down sulfur and fire from the heavens upon Sodom and Gomorrah, destroying not just the cities themselves, but the entire surrounding region, even the vegetation. In a traditional reading, this is seen as divine punishment. But when we revisit this scene through a modern lens, and we have to ask, what exactly is being described here? The intervention begins with the arrival of two beings from elsewhere, who give advance warning to selected individuals. Then comes a targeted strike from the sky, with overwhelming destructive power. The fire doesn't rise from the ground, it falls from above. There's no army, no battle, just a flash of light, a shockwave, and total destruction of both cities. And during the escape, another detail stands out. Lot and his family are given a clear command: flee and don't look back. But his wife, perhaps out of sorrow or simple curiosity, turns around, and she is, according to the text, turned into a pillar of salt. Again, what might that mean to us today? If this was a massive detonation, a blinding flash, or extreme radiation, then turning to look directly at the blast could very well have been fatal. Not divine punishment, but direct exposure to a shockwave, to intense heat, or to powerful radiation. Some might see this as evidence of a surgical strike using a nuclear-like weapon triggered by a technology the ancient world had never witnessed before. What if it wasn't divine punishment, but an exogenous intervention, a purification, a cleansing operation carried out by a higher intelligence, with motives we can't fully grasp? Another part of this story is especially intriguing. In the account of Sodom, the two angels arrive at dusk, and immediately Lot understands they're not like everyone else. He gets up, bows before them, calls them lords, and begs them to come into his home. The townspeople too notice something unusual. They gather in large numbers outside Lot's house, demanding to see the strangers. But these angels don't have wings, no glowing aura. They don't fly, they walk. Nothing formally distinguishes them from men, and yet they're perceived as fundamentally different. So what made them so recognizable? Maybe it was their demeanor, their gaze, their presence. Or maybe it was something more tangible, their physical appearance. Yes, but above all, their clothing, a material unknown to that time, a strange texture, a fabric that looks smooth, radiant, metallic, or simply abnormal for the era. Imagine just for a second two beings wearing advanced technological suits in a world where people only knew linen, wool, or animal hides. The contrast would have been overwhelming, enough for Lot to treat them like nobles, enough for the entire town to become agitated. Maybe they didn't have wings. Maybe what the Bible calls angels. Zebue was actually something else, something more real, more physical, exogenous visitors perhaps. What if it wasn't divine punishment, but an exogenous intervention, a cleansing, a targeted operation carried out by a higher intelligence, with motives beyond our understanding? There's another part of this story that's especially intriguing. In the account of Sodom, two angels arrive at dusk, and instantly Lot senses they are not like ordinary men. He stands up, bows low, calls them lords, and begs them to enter his home. The townspeople notice too. They swarm the house, demanding to see the strangers. But these angels don't have wings, no glowing halos. They don't fly, they walk. Nothing outwardly sets them apart from humans. And yet, they're unmistakably different. So what made them stand out? Maybe it was their presence, their gaze, their energy. Or maybe it was something more physical. Their appearance, yes, but above all, their clothing. A fabric unknown to that time. Strange, smooth, luminous, metallic, something entirely alien to the ancient world. Imagine it, two beings in advanced suits, walking through a civilization that only knew linen, wool, and leather. The contrast would have been shocking. Enough for Lot to revere them, enough for a whole city to panic. Maybe they didn't mais they can't, because they didn't need them. Maybe what the Bible calls angels was something else entirely, something real, something tangible, exogenous visitors perhaps. If we're willing to reread this passage from the Old Testament with modern eyes, then a disturbing hypothesis begins to emerge. What if the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't a myth or a moral metaphor, but the first historical account of a nuclear strike on ancient humanity? In that context, the angels become emissaries. The divine punishment becomes a strategic operation. And the Bible becomes an ancestral document, one that may have preserved in its oldest pages the trace of a contact, an intervention, or even a warning from elsewhere. Let's take another example. Moses and the pillar of cloud and fire. When the Hebrew people flee Egypt under Moses' leadership, they cross a vast and unknown desert. And according to the biblical text, it's not just Moses who guides them, but a celestial presence, constant, visible, and almost physical. In the book of Exodus, chapter 13, it says, "The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel by day and by night." This phenomenon follows the Hebrews throughout their entire journey in the desert. It moves, shifts positions, and stops when the people need to set up camp. So it's not a symbolic or poetic image. The text is clear. The pillar is there visible, moving, guiding, and protecting them day and night. In traditional religious interpretation, this pillar represents the divine presence walking alongside its people. But from a modern perspective, it's hard not to see something else. A flying structure, equipped with a source of light, capable of moving through the sky, emitting a bright glow at night and smoke during the day. That description, in a modern context, points to something entirely different. An artificial light, maybe a propulsion system or a spotlight coming down from the sky. What if this pillar wasn't a mystical phenomenon, but a flying technology, silently monitoring a group of humans on the move? It's also hard to ignore how precise its movements are. The text says this presence guided them, stopped, moved again, shifted position like a piloted craft, intelligent, following a clear purpose. What if this pillar was an ancient exogenous drone or a logistical support vehicle sent by a higher intelligence, controlled perhaps by an entity guiding a chosen group without ever fully revealing itself? Once again, the people of that time had no words for what they didn't understand. No concept of a craft, no idea of technology, just a strange light in the sky shining at night, producing smoke by day and leading them to their destination. In the book of Genesis, another passage brief, but mysterious, catches our attention. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, is fleeing from his brother Esau. Alone in the wilderness, he lies down to sleep, using a stone as a pillow. And that's when he has a strange, powerful vision, one whose deeper meaning remains open to interpretation even today. Here's what the text says. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to the heavens. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it. This isn't just a simple wooden ladder, it's not a vague or blurry dream. Jacob sees an immense vertical structure stretching from earth to the heavens, and along it, beings are moving up and down, beings he identifies as angels. And at the very top, a presence, an intelligence, a voice. In religious tradition, this is seen as a symbol, a connection between God and mankind, a spiritual bridge, an image of faith. But there's another way to read it. What if what Jacob saw, it wasn't a ladder in the physical sense, but a vertical beam of light, an energy column, a teleportation shaft, a connection between the earth and a craft hovering in the sky, and the angels moving up and down? Maybe they weren't winged beings at all, but biological or technological entities traveling back and forth between a stationary ship and the surface below. Today, we can imagine a technology advanced enough to send entities down from a high-altitude UFO, cloaked or invisible, through a vertical corridor of light. A phenomenon so strange, so spectacular, that an ancient witness would naturally describe it using the only words he had: a ladder, angels, the heavens. Once again, the words of the past speak of a world they didn't understand. In the collective imagination, angels are often depicted as beautiful, winged beings, radiant, wise, and carrying divine messages. This image was shaped by centuries of Christian iconography, Byzantine frescoes, and theological interpretation. But if we go back to the original text, especially those of the Old Testament, a different picture begins to emerge. Stranger, more unsettling, and maybe more technological. Again and again, these angels aren't described as ethereal beings made of light, but as men from the sky, powerful, intimidating, instantly recognizable as not from here. They move through the air, appear suddenly in blinding light, manipulate matter, drive entire armies into retreat, or even wipe out entire cities, like in the case of Sodom. Some texts even suggest that these beings didn't have wings, unlike the image passed down through medieval Christian tradition. Instead, they wore strange garments made of materials the people of the time couldn't identify. Perhaps suits, armor, equipment, like something worn by explorers from another world. So what if these angels, these celestial messengers, weren't divine beings in the religious sense, but entities from another world? Exogenous visitors using advanced technology to make themselves visible, to communicate, or even to intervene in human history. One particularly disturbing example, often overlooked in traditional interpretations, is the destruction of Sodom, as told in the book of Genesis. As we saw earlier, Lot, the nephew of Abraham, is living in this city described as corrupt, depraved, and doomed. Two angels are sent to warn him of the imminent danger and to help him and his family escape before destruction rains down on the city. But these two angels don't appear in any classical supernatural form. The biblical text first introduces them as men, yet one unsettling detail remains. They are immediately recognized as different. Nowhere does the text mention wings or any heavenly glow. And yet, Lot instantly identifies them as special, and the people of the city react with hostility to their presence. That suggests something in their appearance, their speech, or their demeanor revealed an origin unlike that of ordinary humans. Perhaps it was their clothing made of unknown materials, or visible technological elements that went completely over the heads of ancient observers. Dressed in strange garments, clearly powerful, they come across as more than just visitos. They are entities that inspire both fear and reverence without ever being explicitly identified as angels in the mystical sense. And during the attack on Lot's house by the men of the city, the two beings reveal a strange ability presented in the text as a supernatural intervention. But the angels reached out their hands, pulled Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. Then they struck the men at the entrance of the house, young and old alike, with blindness, so that they wore themselves out trying to find the door. This scene, when viewed through a modern lens, could be interpreted as the use of a light-based weapon, a form of sensory disruption, or even a targeted neutralization technology. In any case, nothing in the human experience of that time could explain such a phenomenon. The text continues. We are going to destroy this place because the outcry against its people is so great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. These two beings are not just messengers. They are executors of a plan, agents of a higher force, tasked with the physical destruction of the city. A mission that is clear, calculated, and ruthlessly effective. In this exogenous reading, the two angels appear more like emissaries from elsewhere. Entities sent to assess, intervene, and carry out a targeted operation, following what resembles a strict intervention protocol. Not allegorical or spiritual figures, but operators from a more advanced world, equipped with technology so powerful that it was mistaken for divine power. Let's look at another equally fascinating biblical example. In the book of Genesis, after Adam and Eve are cast out of the Garden of Eden, one detail stands out. God places at the entrance of this sacred place two cherubim, fearsome guardians, armed with a flaming sword to protect the way to the tree of life. This passage is often read symbolically, but it deserves to be re-examined through the lens of an exogenous hypothesis. We're clearly far from the popular image of chubby little angels. In ancient Jewish tradition, these cherubim are described as massive entities, beings with four wings, intense piercing eyes, and wielding weapons of light. Some apocryphal texts and rabbinic commentaries go even further. They speak of heavenly soldiers, almost mechanical in nature, like living automatons programmed to defend a place of extreme importance. But what stands out most in this passage is the deeply physical nature of these beings. They are never described as misty spirits or ethereal, immaterial creatures. On the contrary, they are portrayed as solid, tangible guardians, wielding fearsome weapons. In this case, a flaming sword, a weapon of powerful light, capable of preventing any human from approaching. This description sounds far more like advanced technology than a mere spiritual symbol. So it's a fair question to ask. Were these cherubim truly angels in the religious sense, or were they exogenous entities sent to guard the entrance to a sacred place, or perhaps even a strategic site off limits to humans? The weapon described might resemble a plasma weapon or some form of defensive device designed to prevent intrusion. From this perspective, the Garden of Eden may no longer appear as just a founding myth, but rather as a distant memory, a technological enclosure of extraterrestrial origin, guarded by powerful entities who were not spiritual beings, but operational ones, exogenous visitors. And when we dive into the original text of the Old Testament, we find that the most frequently used word for go is not Yahweh and not Adonai, but Elohim. And here's where things get interesting, because Elohim is a plural, the plural of Eloah. In ancient Hebrew, El means light in the divine sense or power. The suffix im is a masculine plural, so Elohim literally means the gods or divine powers. And yet in most modern translations of the Bible, this plural is systematically rendered as singular without explanation, as if it were obvious. But what if we respected the true plural meaning of the word? How would the stories of Genesis change if God became the gods? Or more precisely, if these Elohim were understood as a group of superior beings physically intervening on earth in a distant past. Throughout the Old Testament, these Elohim act, move, speak, eat, become angry, make decisions. Their behavior doesn't reflect that of an abstract principle, but of powerful embodied beings. And most importantly, they are not alone. One very famous passage from Genesis makes this traditional reading even more questionable. And I'm sure you all know it. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took as wives any they chose among them. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the mighty men of old, men of renown. This verse, which comes just before the story of the flood, speaks of the sons of God, a term often associated with the Elohim, or beings belonging to that group who took human women as wives, resulting in an extraordinary offspring. The Nephilim, powerful giants briefly mentioned in the text, before disappearing in the waters of divine judgment. At this point, we are no longer dealing with metaphor. The text speaks of physical relations between two different species, between entities that came from the sky and human women. Read literally, this story strongly resembles modern accounts of exogenous hybridization, often reported in certain UFO testimonies. Once again, the language of the time may be hiding a far more direct reality. Where classical theology sees a spiritual fall, the exogenous perspective sees a biological event, a genetic, even civilizational intervention, a real interaction between two worlds, one that may have deeply shaped the earliest human civilizations. Through this lens, when we revisit the entire Old Testament, a whole new perspective begins to emerge, a group of beings from elsewhere, shaping ancient humanity, molding it according to their own traits and intentions. And what if the biblical narrative was never meant to be a symbolic spiritual creation, but a distorted memory of actual contact with non-human entities? So far, we've only touched on the most striking examples from the Old Testament. But in truth, accounts of possible exogenous encounters are everywhere in ancient and medieval texts. Everyone has heard, for instance, of the Vimanas, the flying palaces described in the ancient Vedic scriptures of India, written thousands of years ago. These massive structures, often piloted by gods, were said to fly through the skies, wage battles, and bring terror down upon the earth. Much closer to our time, we also find astonishing testimonies, like the celestial phenomenon over Nuremberg in 1561. On that morning, many witnesses claim to have seen an aerial battle between various flying objects, spheres, crosses, cylinders, right in the sky above the city. Even some Roman Empire writers described flying shields appearing above towns, accounts clearly shaped by the language, tools, and worldview of their time. And that's the whole point of this perspective. The words of the witnesses may change over the centuries, but what they saw might belong to a deeper reality, a more constant, tangible, physical one. A silent presence moving through ages and civilizations. And still, to this day, it continues to challenge everything we think we know.